This is the story of one of the most transcendental moments in history, the crucifixion of Jesus. But not from the point of view that we normally know, but from the eyes of a soldier. Imagine the weight of this scene, the impact of seeing someone, whom many called the Messiah, being condemned and crucified. But not just any soldier. This is the one who, according to tradition, took his spear and pierced Jesus in his last moment of life. Can you imagine what he could have felt after that? What would go through his mind in the following days? History tells that this soldier wrote a letter narrating his experiences, the details of that day, and how that moment changed his life. This is not just a historical document. It is a testimony of someone who faced such a profound truth that it would lead him to question his purpose, his faith, and his future. Perhaps, by listening to his story, we also discover something that God wants to show us today, something that we do not always see in the middle of our daily routine or our own difficulties. The letter of the soldier begins by saying, "To you, dear friend and brother in arms, I write with great concern from this city of Jerusalem, where the days have become dark. I confess that this missive is not about the glory of battle or the customs of our militia, but a fact that, although alien to war, has deeply disturbed my soul. I want to tell you what happened in the place called Golgotha. Many here also call it the Mount of the Skull, and how a man named Jesus was placed on a cross under our custody. From an early age, there was an air of expectation, a tension that seemed to touch the very soul of all of us who were present. We went to the mountain with 3 men destined to die. But the crowd gathered around one of them with particular interest. This Jesus, who is said to have been a prophet, healer, and guide of the crowd, had been given to death by his own religious leaders. Around him, people were whispering, some mocking each other with hurtful words, others murmuring in a tone of sadness or confusion. Taking him to Golgotha was a procession full of weight, and I'm not just talking about the weight of the cross that he was carrying with great difficulty, but of an invisible load deeper than it seemed to crush him. He, who was already wounded and bloody after the scourges, barely had strength to continue, and his body showed the martyrdom to which he had been subjected. But what bothered me the most was his face. Even in his exhaustion, he maintained an expression of calm that was incomprehensible to me. There was no hatred or despair in his semblance, but a serene resignation that only those who have a higher purpose in their heart could sustain. While we were assuring him to the cross, one of ours, following the customs, offered him a sponge with vinegar, mixed with myrrh as a palliative of his suffering, or for some as the last act of contempt. It was a common mixture that we offered to the condemned to soak their senses and soften, even a little, the pains of the torment. When he tried it, however, he rejected it. He did not want, my friend, not even the slightest relief in his suffering. His face did not show reproach, only an acceptance of his pain, as if each wound was his own. Each nail and each thorn had a purpose that had to be fully fulfilled. This man, who is said to be the son of a god, decided to face each blow of his luck without moving away from his destiny. And I, used to executing the law and keep order without repair, I felt that I was witnessing something that my eyes could not fully understand. How many times have we witnessed death, and how many times have we despised the tears of those who mourn for their lives? But this time, in the silence of that man, I perceived a force and a mystery. Thank you. That day, they have accompanied me without ceasing. From my position, I observed something that still moves me when I remember. Among the multitude of curious jokers and passers-by were some figures who did not join the mockery or the morbidity. They were those who, regardless of the risk, remained close to Jesus. There was his mother, a woman who endured the weight of seeing her son on the cross without turning away, although the pain marked his face like a burning iron. Next to him was one of his disciples, a young man who seemed distressed, whom they called Juan, kept a fixed gaze on the teacher with a mixture of sadness and reverence. Both, Maria and Juan, remained firm, enduring a suffering that I have rarely seen in my years of service. There was something indescribable in those moments, the atmosphere full of solemnity, and although there were mockery around, some began to remain silent. I saw other disciples, those who had followed him, looking in the distance, fearful, their faces reflecting a pain and uncertainty that not even the bravest soldier could bear without breaking. In the midst of his torment, Jesus raised his voice and looked at his mother, and then at John, the faithful disciple. With a broken voice, full of compassion and firmness, he said, "O woman, here is your son." And addressing John, he added, "Here is your mother." In those words, I did not only see a sample of filial love, but a surrender and a deeper union of what I could understand until then. Even in his agony, it seemed that Jesus thought of those he loved, leaving in his hands something that, as I see now, was sacred to him. Then, amigo mío, ocurrió algo que marcó aquel día para todos los que estábamos presentes. Around midday, an inexplicable darkness began to cover the earth, a mantle of shadows that did not dissipate and enveloped us all in an overwhelming silence. For a moment, the bustle ceased, and the crowd, without understanding, kept a reverential silence. It seemed as if nature itself was participating in that death, as if heaven closed itself so as not to look at what was happening in the Golgotha. Then Jesus raised his voice again and exclaimed with a cry that shook the hearts of all, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I felt a shudder, and even now those words resonate in me deeply. Shortly after, he bowed his head and exhaled, as if he were finally giving his spirit with full determination. And when his life ceased, a tremor shook the earth. The earth itself seemed to moan, the stones crumbled under our feet, and the panic spread among the crowd. Some shouted that truly that man was the Son of God, and others fled, fearful, as if in some way they understood that they were facing a mystery that surpassed the human. I myself, used to the harshness of military life and to endure suffering without looking, I was overwhelmed by something inexplicable. That man on the cross, his last cry, the darkness that surrounded us. I do not know how to explain it, but something in me began to break, and an inner voice whispered to me that that day was not like others. Was it possible that it was really who they said it was? I do not know. The Son of God. My mind could not understand it, but my spirit began to awaken to a reality that, until then, was completely unknown. The orders are clear in times of execution, and the fulfillment must be precise. After the last sigh of Jesus, one of my superiors approached and, with a firm gesture, told me to confirm his death. In our trade, we know that no man can remain on the cross without us being sure of his departure. It is a custom, and it is a duty, to make sure that the suffering has concluded. So with the spear in hand, I advanced towards that inert body, with the intention of completing the task and verifying that there was no life left in it. There was a cold determination in my mind, that which arises from duty, but the closer I got to Jesus, something in me was wavering. I could not say what was bothering me exactly, but I felt as if every step towards it increased the weight of the spear in my hand. In front of the cross, I raised my weapon and directed it to the side of his body, a precise and trained movement, seeking to fulfill what had been ordered to me without any question. When I nailed the spear to his side, a torrent of blood came out of the wound, but it was not only blood. También una agua clara, semiclava con ella. Esta mezcla inusual y sin explicación me hizo retroceder unos pasos sorprendido y confundido. Jamás había presenciado algo semejante en todas mis ejecuciones. Why no solo mi mirada, sino también mi corazón? Brought our own senior movement Sahi committee speedy to on thing the orange tea comenzaba against the fresh mission team by the local room profundo respeto ultimo unsentimental canonically experiment, although in total stress cruel Douglas Cabia prison ceiling in frenzy as a clergy in Vita. Sent to get started on to meet Syria, most profundo came a move to Misma. I stood motionless for a few moments, observing that calm face, still serene in death, and I understood that it was not just a man punished on the cross. This was someone whose death enclosed a meaning that my reason could not reach, but that my soul began to glimmer. The flow of water and blood seemed to be a symbol, something sacred, that awakened in me a consciousness that until then had been asleep. Perhaps, my dear friend, it was at that moment that my heart began to be pierced as well. With my own spear, I wounded that man. But it was as if, in doing so, his life and his mystery crossed my being. I do not know what to say more than, after seeing that, the certainty that this Jesus was special was engraved in the depths of my being. And I felt that his death was calling me in some way that I still do not understand. What followed the death of Jesus is difficult to narrate, and I fear that my words will not be able to fully describe what we witness. After the tremor that shook the mountain and the sky covered by a strange darkness, a concern began to take hold of the crowd. The screams of mockery ceased, and the tone of contempt gave way to a heavy and fearful silence. I saw how many of those who had so far been mocked began to retreat, some taking their hands to their chests, as if suddenly they felt that the place where they were was sacred. Whispers began to hear words that none of us expected to hear. Some murmured to each other, pointing out that perhaps this Jesus was really the Son of God, as he himself had affirmed. Others, on the other hand, moved away in silence, as if they understood that something extraordinary had happened before their eyes, and they did not know how to face it. It was strange to see a crowd that acted so aggressively minutes before. Transformarse en una procesión de personas cabizbajas y temerosas que se dispersaban poco a poco, sin atrever siquiera a mirar hacia la cruz. Nosotros, los soldados, nos encontrábamos igualmente inquietos. Algunos de mis compañeros, curdos en la rudeza y el desdén hacia estos eventos, they began to exchange looks full of doubt. No one dared to say it out loud, but the fear had touched even the toughest among us. Some were persecuted and murmured prayers, as if they felt they were in the presence of something sacred and feared for their own souls. For my part, I could not put aside the image of that serene face in death. The burning pain in his chest and the strange blood and water Irish. I knew my spirit had been touched somewhere beyond my understanding, and I couldn't help but stay there asking myself if I had made such a terrible mistake that my life would never be the same again. I also knew that those who had followed him, his disciples, had disappeared among the shadows, hiding so as not to face the same fate. Some of them, who had accompanied Jesus for years, now feared for their lives. And the weight of the loss was added to the fear that the authorities would come for them at any moment. In his hiding place, I imagine, the silence must have been as unbearable as the emptiness that his teacher had left. I don't know if these words will be enough to make you understand, my friend, but they were real. But what we lived that day in Golgotha was more than the death of a man. It was as if heaven, earth, and the heart of all who were present recognized that something out of the ordinary had happened. For us, it was a moment when the border between life and the divine was drawn apart. And although I do not know what will come next, I am certain that this Jesus, who died under our guard, left a mark on my soul forever. Can know this the appeal the ano golgo de el peso de los who sit here to know me a digioto descansar no pasa una noche, sin que la imagen de Jesus en la cruz y el flujo de sangre y agua votando de su costado regress, as if those scenes were engraved in the depths of my being. What did that mean? Who was this man who calmly faced death? And how did my spear, a tool of punishment, end up being an instrument of something I perceive as sacred? This storm has made me look for answers that I never thought I would need. I often find myself remembering the words of the crowd, the whispers of those who murmured that Jesus was the Son of God. And I wonder if they were truly right. Before that day, all of this seemed to me to be superstition and meaningless devotion, things of the simple and credulous. But now, my friend, it is as if a door had opened inside me, and I find no peace without knowing more about who this Jesus was and what his life and death meant. Since that day in the Golgotha, my friend, my life has been a constant storm of thoughts and memories that do not leave me in peace. The nights that used to be refuge after the hard day. They have become moments of vigil in which, even with my eyes closed, I see the face of Jesus. His look, which I found so serene even in the midst of his agony, seems to look at me now with an unfathomable compassion, as if somehow he knew who I am and what I did. That look chases me, not as a reproach, but as a truth that I cannot ignore. I have become a slave to those memories. Every time I close my eyes, I see the darkness covering the earth, the tremor that shook the ground, and the mixture of blood and water that sprang from its side. It's as if all those details had been tattooed on my mind, reminding me every day that I witnessed something that I will never fully understand. And although my heart longs for answers, I only have fragments of understanding and certainty, forever. That nothing in my life will be the same. With time, the burden of those memories and of what I witnessed led me to an inevitable decision. I can no longer raise the spear against any man. Not after having felt that the life I took on the cross of Golgotha was not a common life. My sword and my spear, which I used so many times without question, will never be forgotten. Now I find them unbearable. Every time I think of getting up to fulfill orders, I feel that I am betraying something sacred that awakened within me. Thus I decided that I had to leave the life of a soldier, abandon violence, and seek a new purpose, although I still do not know which one it could be. Since I left the army, my life has been a journey of loneliness and search. Camino por esta tierra, observando lo que vi y viví, intentando hallar alguna verdad que de sentido a este peso en mi alma. Pregunto por ahí sobre el hombre llamado Jesus. Escucho historias de quienes lo seguían, y aprendo de quienes hablan de sus enseñanzas. And although I don't have all the answers, every day I get a little closer to the certainty that that moment in Golgotha was something more than the death of a man. It was, perhaps, the beginning of something that transcends time and human understanding. Before I say goodbye, I will tell you, my friend, about the man I saw on the cross that day. For it is difficult for me to erase from my memory the man I saw on the cross. The image of his face and his presence. Jesus was there, barely covered by a simple cloak that, in the midst of the wind and blood, could barely cover his body marked by the bruises and suffering. His appearance reflected the fatigue and agony of what he had endured, and yet there was in him a dignity and a humility that are not easily found in this world. Jesus, in his physical appearance. He was a man of thin figure and medium height, with a body covered with lacerations and marks of the cruel scourge he had suffered. His skin was pale and stained by the blood that ran from his forehead, where a crown of thorns had been nailed with contempt. Each thorn seemed to penetrate with such depth that his eyebrows were soaked with that dark red that descended to his beard, a trail of suffering that framed his look. His dark hair fell in disordered spots on his shoulders, some stuck to the skin by the dry blood and sweat, while his lips, cracked and dry, were covered in blood. They were barely moving, pronouncing inaudible words that seemed to be heading to a place that none of us could see. Their hands, strong but thin, were tense, extended, and held with thick nails that pierced flesh and bone while their fingers twisted, as if seeking to cling to something invisible in the midst of pain. Their feet, their hands, and their fingers, one on top of the other, they were also pierced by a nail that kept them suspended on the wood. Each muscle of their body reflected the effort to stay in that position. And yet, in the midst of that torment, there was something inexplicably serene in their port, as if still subject to the cross. He had a strength and dignity that elevated him beyond the physical suffering that surrounded him. His face, marked by sweat, dirt, and blood, had a serenity that contradicted the obvious pain of his condition. His gaze, he had never before seen eyes like those of Jesus. There was no hate or resentment in them, even when the insults rained from the crowd and the soldiers. It was a look that embraced everything, even those who despised him and made fun of him. It was as if in his eyes he carried the burden of the pain of all men, and at the same time, a compassion that made me feel small, without knowing exactly why. When I looked at his hands and feet nailed to the cross, I saw how every slight movement to and every attempt to breathe, to relieve the weight that fell on his chest, had to cause an unbearable pain. But he did not scream or implore for relief. Even in those terrible moments, he seemed to hold on with a calm that he could not understand. It was as if the pain he suffered had a meaning that went beyond the flesh. Y la sangre estando allí observando-lo en sus últimos instants, empieza a notar algo que me llenaba de desconcierto. Each hombre in the midst of death, he transmitted a peace and a compassion that none of us could understand. It was as if, in his silence, he offered an inexplicable forgiveness to all those present. I felt that peace enveloped us all, as if even his enemies were welcomed under his gaze. Perhaps it was then when, for the first time, I had the impression that I was before someone divine. Until that moment, I had seen Jesus as one more man, a condemned man like so many others, but while I was watching him on the cross, his presence left me perplexed. I do not know how to express it, but I felt that in that wounded body and in those compassionate eyes, there was something sacred, something that was far beyond my understanding. And although I did not fully understand, from that moment, nothing in me was the same again. Amen. After a while from that dark afternoon in Golgotha, rumors began to come that spoke of something even more extraordinary. They said that Jesus, that same man whom we crucified, had risen from among the dead, and that his disciples had seen him alive. They even claimed to have seen him ascend to heaven. I was not a direct witness of these events, but the voices and testimonies of those who followed them with devotion filled my ears. At first, I doubted whether to believe such stories. After all, I had never heard a man return from death. But, in the depths of my being, I knew that if someone could transcend even that last threshold, it would be possible. With time, I stopped questioning the incomprehensible and allowed the message that Jesus had left, that message of faith, forgiveness, and hope, to fill my soul. I don't need to have seen with my own eyes his return, because in my heart I know that the man I saw on the cross was truly who he claimed to be. His life and his sacrifice became, for me, a lighthouse in the middle of the darkness. Today I believe faithfully in him, and although I cannot fully explain it, I feel that his spirit lives not only in those who knew him, but also in those like me who were transformed by his presence. Now I understand that the faith that he preached does not demand proof, but invites us to trust in what we cannot see, with the certainty that hope is our true strength. AC me despido. With the hope that this letter, which has accompanied me in my transformation, serves for others to understand what I saw and what changed in me that day. May my testimony remain here, as proof that even the most hardened can find in a single moment the seed of a new life. I have decided to write you this letter, in part to give order to the thoughts that torment me, and in part because I feel that what we lived that day deserves to be remembered beyond the orders and norms of the militia. That moment in the Golgotha was somehow a breaking point in my life, and although I don't have all the answers, I wanted to leave this story so that you and others can know what it was like to be there, how it felt to witness the death of someone that many call divine. My hope is that these words, although humble, serve as testimony of what my eyes saw and of the anxiety that has lived in my heart since then. I don't know if one day I will fully understand what happened that day, but I leave here my doubts and experiences as a legacy that, perhaps, one day may give light to others. Here ends the story of the soldier, a letter that has left us a testimony of what he saw and felt in the Golgotha, before one of the most transcendental moments in history. How not to wonder, upon hearing his words, what we would have done in his place. This soldier, direct witness of the crucifixion, and who was not a follower of Jesus from the beginning, felt his life transform at the root of that day. His story invites us to reflect on how, even those who seem most distant to faith can discover in their hearts a call for something much greater. The story of this soldier also invites us to ask ourselves what it really means to have faith and how that faith can arise even in those who, due to circumstances in life, find themselves distant. What traces does hope leave in each of us? How do we respond when we feel a call that transcends human understanding? It is a story that leads us to see the crucifixion and resurrection from a human and vulnerable perspective, but also of redemption, showing that there always is a place for transformation and hope in the mystery of the cross. If this story moved you, we invite you to share it so that others can also know the transformative power of this testimony. At the end of this video, 2 other recommended content from the channel will appear. We invite you to watch them and to continue exploring more about these stories and reflections of faith. May God bless you and always protect you. Amen.